Hi, welcome back to Organizational Behavior. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 11. So, Chapter 11 is all about communication. When most of us think about communication, we most likely immediately jump to oral communication. When we think of oral communication, we assume synchronicity, with both the sender and receiver present, aware, and focused on the communication exchange, like two people talking in the same room. The advantage of synchronous communication is speed, feedback, exchange. However, given the advent of technological advances in communication, we're going to discuss this more in this chapter, it may surprise you to learn that oral communication can also be asynchronous, much like this course, with verbal messages sent and received outside the physical present communication exchange that we're also used to. Now, regardless of whether we are psychologically or physically present when communicating with others, we should acknowledge that we are usually bad listeners. We are often prone to listening burnout, in which we tune other people out, think about what we're going to say next, or rush to offer advice. So people are generally some of the worst listeners, especially at work, especially when you're discussing topics you may not be fully interested in. So active listening is a type of listening where we're actively engaged in sensing and processing others' communication methods. And then we respond in ways that show we actively engaged with the conversation and help us become more present in oral communication. In addition to active listening, reflective listening acknowledges, restates, and reformulates others' messages to provide non-judgmental affirmation and encourage them to further elaborate or share, which will help us become better listeners. And one way this does is if someone's talking to you and you're able to respond in a reflective way that shows that you're comprehending and listening to what they're saying, this makes the other person more engaged and more likely to continue conversing at a high level. Now, meetings are often a formal structure where there's a formal discussion or conversation that's going to include multiple people taking place, usually in the workplace or over Zoom. Now, organizational behavior can contribute to the conversation of how organizations can make meetings more effective, more useful. Some suggestions are only met when it is truly needed, but gathering input from attendees prior to the meeting, providing an agenda, delegating roles, and limiting distractions, and setting a firm start and end time for the meeting is a great way to get started. So managers and team leaders alike need to recognize the importance of speeches in influencing, motivating perspectives and understanding of others. So you can see that communication has many dynamic modes to it. If we look at this exhibit 11-1, is going to show active and reflective listening can be employed during the process by using both managers and employees to become better listeners. And that's the ultimate goal, is that we become better listeners. So this exhibit involves 3 steps, which follow one after the other: sensing, processing, responding. Responding returns to sensing through reflective listening. Sensing involves actively sensing oral and non-verbal communications, such as body language. Processing through assigning meaning and value in messages, ascertaining subtle or context messages. Responding involves a response in a timely manner, expressing, engaging orally or non-verbally, with eye contact, body language. So this is the basic process. It's also intuitive to all of us. So let's switch to written communication. Written communication is very important because now you have an artifact that someone could go back and revisit, or even you can use to support your position, or it can be used against you. So you have to be very careful when writing letters, emails, instant messages, blogs, newsletters. So these methods are going to convey written words, symbols, and it's going to create a physical record, which is an advantage because it can be referenced, it can be saved, and it can be utilized later for future proof, such as you sent an email, someone claims you didn't send an email, and then you could go and resend the email showing them that you had indeed sent the email. Now, one thing we do very frequently is check email. Email, for me, is quite ridiculous. I have at least 5 email accounts, and I check the email as frequently as I can. But there's billions of users worldwide that are operating or sending multiple emails a day from over 6 billion email accounts. Now, as an employee, email is a big part of your job. It's how you're going to communicate probably the most with each other. So you need to manage your inbox effectively, especially if you're struggling from email overload. So one thing you do is that helps me sometimes is turn off notifications so you're not constantly interrupted when you're trying to work. Check your email at regular intervals. If you want to set it in 3-hour intervals and make it sort of a habit, instead of checking every 10 minutes, and, being obsessive about it is not helpful. Immediately move your email out of your inbox after reading. Use search functions and email filters to help find emails rather than scrolling endlessly. Use shortcuts to achieve emails in small numbers or categorize folders. Single out important emails individually, process and treat them as important. Maybe put them in groups. Use reply all, although only when all people receiving your response is necessary. And remember, it's not in-person dialogue. Avoid the temptation to skim or skip emails. Think before you send. So the important thing here too is, one thing, if someone sends you an email, you should always respond. If it's a colleague, if it's someone you know in person, it's someone you work with. Of course, you don't have to respond to advertisements or promotions, but if someone sends you an email, don't let the non-response be your response. Always have a response. Be polite and courteous, and double check your grammar and spelling, because your email is a representation of you and your professionalism. Now, if you let email overwhelm you and you can't get any work done, then email is not serving a proper purpose. So you need to maybe remove yourself from some email groups, or figure out a way to make email more productive for you. Okay. Now, texting is another way that people stay in communication. So instant message is a big way that people stay connected, and this can be done, through your phone, of course, through your computer, and it involves sending a message directly, a text message directly to each other. And there's a lot of nuances now with these text messages these days, sometimes referred to as DMs, as in the popular saying, slide into my DMs. But unlike email, instant messaging or text messaging have a strong immediacy in expecting a response quickly. There's even settings where you could which I recommend turning off the feature where it shows that you read a text, because if you read a text, they expect a response immediately. And if you don't want someone to know that you've read their text, you may want to turn that feature off, so that way they're not disappointed when you don't respond quickly. So now, because you're expected to respond quickly, it almost becomes like a conversation. So that if you are making these texts and they get in the habit of you responding quickly, they're going to expect that in the future. Now, there's a benefit from having this written communication as an artifact, although people don't always use their natural speaking tone or as formal as an email address when they're talking. So texting has now been appropriate for businesses and moved from a private thing to businesses. So texting is okay for inter-office communications. It's often preferable to leave a text message rather than a voicemail. People don't like to talk on the phone anymore, and they don't like to answer voicemails. So in many cases, text messaging is something that is essential at work. There's even professional business programs like Slack that help organize and create a more professional environment for instant messaging. But it's an important new form of communication between people. Now, nonverbal communication is just as important. The way people react, their emotions are written on their faces, on their body languages. So you can perceive emotions, make appraisals based on people's emotional expressions. So body language can convey status, level of engagement, emotional state, and adds often clarifies with the verbal communication. So studies indicate that people read much more about another's attitude and emotions from their nonverbal cues in their words. So, be careful when, if you're not a good actor, your body language will give you away. So just, different senses that you have in the physical space is all part of communication as well. Now, the choice of whether to schedule a meeting or a phone call or send an email or a text message, it can be rather complicated. So after determining what the norms and guidelines of your organization is, it might be helpful to match the message with the method. So for example, oftentimes if you receive an email, it's expected that you respond as an email. If you receive a text message, to respond as a text message. But if you're initiating the response, then you need to think about, how big is the task? Is it appropriate for an email, a text message? What is the expectations of your colleagues? Do you need to convey emotions? Maybe in-person communication would be better. Maybe a text message with emojis would be better. Is it, how important is the message? How collaborative is the message? These are all things that you have to kind of guess and judge and figure out before you place the message and what type of message that you're going to use. So in-person or a virtual meeting, this slide is discussing when it's appropriate to do more of an in-person or virtual meeting. So virtual meetings are usually for when you're not in the vicinity or people are not close together. If people are in the same office, then usually should always meet in person. Otherwise, if people are in remote locations, the virtual meeting is the next best thing to meeting in person. Now, phone calls, like I was saying earlier, phone calls are not in these days. People don't like phone calls. Don't call me. Don't leave a voice message. Why? Because people have anxiety with that spontaneity, with being put on the spot. Having to talk on phones is just not as ideal as it used to be in the business area. But there's sometimes where you need an answer right away, and it may involve back and forth or clarification of what you're trying to say. Verbal cues may not be necessary or needed. It might just be more of exchange of facts. And in that case, sometimes a phone call is the best way of communicating because you get immediate response and you get a back and forth and you get a better idea from the vocal inflections of how the person's feeling or how they're answering. So the phone call is appropriate at certain times, but you may find quite often you call somebody and they don't pick up, which is now pretty much a norm in our world. Now, text messages, when are these appropriate? Now, if you need a quick, non-critical response that has a limited number of answers, if there's just brief information you need, or you want to share something quickly, or you want to just comment on something that, or make a soft introduction, maybe you could use a text message to say, hey, are you around for a quick phone call? Or what time is appropriate to call? So sometimes now text messaging can be the gateway to making a phone call, or it could just be for quick, low stakes type of communications. Certainly should not have long, involved emotional conversations through text. Emails are probably your preferred method of communication in the business world. So if you're trying to relay the same message to multiple people, if you're trying to send a message that might include graphics or other tables or charts, it may include attachments or documentations or need approval, emails are probably the best way to go, and I think is the preferred and most common used business communication. In today's world, people generally, if they can avoid it, they'd like to avoid a telephone call, in-person one-on-one communication, and meetings if they can. So that's why texting is often preferred. Now, there are several barriers that can slow down and distort effective communication. Three of the most important barriers to effective communication are information overload. And in today's world of the internet and multiple sources of news and multiple channels, texting, phone, meetings, you can have an information overload. There's also communication apprehension and crisis situations. So when the information we must work with exceeds our processing capabilities, we have information overload. And what happens is when individuals have more information than they can sort through or they can use, they tend to select or ignore or pass over or forget a lot of the information. And that may put further processing off until the overload situation passes. In any case, lost information and less effective communication results make it more important to deal with this overload proactively. So you want to work to manage the amount of information coming into you to help prevent some of this overload, which will minimize your effectiveness. The research has shown that people actually like being overloaded with information on a daily basis. So why do people feel this way? Discomfort with information overload is primarily attributed to the rise in smartphones, in iPads, and people using it to manage large amounts of information. So they feel that devices enable them to keep up with demand, determine what information is most trustworthy, what information to use first, and they have a little bit more control when they're managing large amounts of information. So technology has brought us large amounts of information and we've become comfortable with it. But doesn't mean that we're good at managing large dosages or large amounts of information. Sometimes having a executive summary of the information is much more useful. And there's quite a number of positions where employees are really just taking on data, analyzing data, and creating an executive summary to present in the meeting or present to the higher ups to help reduce their information overload. So if you're like the top person, the director of the department, you have 12 people working for you, you can't be everywhere all the time, know everything, review all the information, so you rely on delegating it, and then you're being debriefed by your employees to help you with that information overload. So one barrier to effective communication is what I had mentioned before, communication apprehension. This results when people experience undue tension or anxiety surrounding their communication with others. So communication apprehension has a number of implications, to affect communications in organizational context. For example, it can affect the emergence of leadership in virtual teams, learning to regulate and cope anxiety about communicating with, other people and communicating about potential solutions. So you have to remember that for most people, communicating with others induces anxiety. Public speaking form of communication is probably top of the list for inducing anxiety. Speaking to your boss, speaking to aggressive or abusive coworkers. Communication apprehension is just, a fear that you'll mess up, you'll say something wrong, that you're going to be judged, that, it's just this anxiety around communicating. It doesn't come easy to most people. And it sometimes could cause you to hold back or not communicate enough because you're afraid of the communication with others itself. Now, the final barrier to effective communication is communication becomes, in crisis mode, communication is extremely difficult. One thing, because in the crisis area, you start to panic, things happen fast. It's difficult to really sit, think, strategize, and analyze what you're going to say or how you're going to communicate. So effective communication during times of crisis involves breaking down the crisis response to several stages. Communicating in anticipation or preparation for crises, managing responses to the crisis while they're occurring, and communicating to stakeholders after the crisis, and developing a reflective observation of learning after the crisis is over. So crisis communication is often much more critical and higher stakes. Okay, let's look at this exhibit here. Exhibit 1114, information, richness, and communication channel. So, so some channels are rich in that they can handle multiple cues simultaneously, facilitate rapid feedback, and be very personal. Others are lean in that they score low in these factors. And if you look at this exhibit, the in-person conversation scores highest in channel richness because it transmits the most and has the most information of any communication method. So multiple information, cues, immediate feedback, personal touch are all present. Impersonal written media such as reports, bulletins, PowerPoints are less so. So the channel, we should range from low richness to high richness, and it's going to start, we start with that low end, which is going to be written reports, memos. Then we have pre-recorded speeches, email, online discussion groups, voicemail, live speeches, telephone conversations, video conferencing, and then in-person communication. So I think we all kind of agree on this scale. It's pretty intuitive from how much information you're going to get from the communication and how useful the communication would be. That's why sometimes there's nothing better than person-to-person direct communication. Now, video conferencing or Zooming or Microsoft Teams, these are all things that are part of the modern age in our current work environment. So we have to be careful of a few things. If you find, oftentimes in a lot of video communications, often in education, you'll see that the blank box or the box with the person's picture, they don't want you to see them because they don't want to inadvertently convey nonverbal behavior that may not be what you're perceiving. So they might be in a situation at home where their behavior, nonverbal behavior, is towards another family member or somebody else in the room, and it has nothing to do with the actual video conferencing. But you have to be mindful at the same time if your camera is on, which most business situations your camera is expected to be on, that you have to be mindful of your nonverbal behavior. Are you laughing? Are you smirking? Are you frowning? Or how are you slumped in your seat? Are your arms crossed? So in the video conference, you have to set the stage, dress up, have a decent background. If the current location is not acceptable, put on a filter. Be aware of all the others on the call. Be aware if the call is being recorded. Make sure you have the best technology, most accurate webcam for clarity, a good microphone, and be careful of video conference fatigue because people, are starting to burn out in video conferencing. The appointment, the meeting everybody. And sometimes it can be overly used. And a lot of these video conferencing have multiple applications and tools. So be frequent on how to and knowledgeable how to share your screen and how to post attachments and how to use the chat room and things of that nature. Now, there's also, in our current age, blogging, vlogging, and podcasting. I think most of you, long ago when I first started introducing and talking about these things, many people had no idea what they were. But today's world, we all know what these things are now. So these are ways of communicating from a person or a few people, usually one person, to multiple people. And a lot of times you're looked at, people who write blogs or video vlogs, which are video logs or podcasts, as a solo business or entrepreneur type of practice. So organizations are also seeing the potential impact that these podcasts, and I'm just going to say podcasts to cover everything at this point, because podcasts, there's some podcasters earning $200 million for contracts on their podcasts because they're that popular and reach that many people. So the trend is starting to take off where corporations are hoping to connect with and engage with large audiences through vlogs, podcasts, or blogs, so they can increase access to get their message across. So companies are now seeing that they can create their own podcast their own vlogs and blogs to communicate with people in a way to get their message across. So if you see a lot of now a lot of TV shows, a lot of corporations will come with, they'll have their own sort of podcast. I know even my local water company now has a podcast. So it's interesting to see how companies are utilizing, it could be a blog that the company is using to communicate in a written context. Well, a lot of times these blogs are also incorporated into their website. Now, blogging is, kind of old school. People TLDR, too long didn't read. People don't want to read as much these days. So vlogging has taken over, where it's the same function, just in a visual medium, where you connect to customers and clients on a more instructional basis, video basis, so you can describe products, show demonstrations more effectively. Now, and podcasts have become sort of like almost having a large reach, like a radio station, where people subscribe to these blogs, and it's usually content focused on a unique subject or topic. And these help to communicate to the masses. As newspapers are fading and cable TV is pulling back, this is becoming the more popular way for companies to communicate with larger groups. Now, e-collaboration and e-learning. So this is a category of communication where the E stands for, could be electronic, where you're using some sort of devices to share content, share media, build, you could build a corporate presence. You could devote this to a lot of different forms, actually, but it's collaborating or learning together through some sort of shared content, sometimes to accomplish work tasks, to manage projects or goals, organize teams, communicate with each other. So there are a lot of tools these days. Well, e-learning is one thing. So if you're you're taking a course right now online, so that's e-learning. But e-collaboration is using scheduling tools. You could use, could be things like Slack, Monday.com, Outlook calendar, and scheduling appointments. And it's just using the software available to help organize people in a better way. And having, I think, a calendar, just a simple calendar, and scheduling appointments and scheduling meetings on a universally shared calendar is a great way to not forget anything. Because it's at this point, there's so many things going on a daily basis. I can't remember what meeting is next or what's happening today, but I always look to my calendar to see what's going on. Now, other things in virtual communication, emojis, usernames, selfies. These are different ways we communicate in the virtual world. So emojis are images that help express emotions. So a lot of times in texting, it's just straight out words, or emails, it's straight out words. And it's easier to communicate how you're feeling with a smiley face, a frowny face, or the, hundreds of emojis out there to help you communicate better. Now, usernames are used in some cases in, not so much in the business world, but in the non-business world, a username is something that you would attribute to, in some cases, projecting your identity, in some cases, just expressing your personality. Selfies are, everybody knows what a selfie is, but sometimes these selfies are, you use pictures. You should always have a picture if you have on your phone or on Zoom or on LinkedIn to communicate, who you are and what you look like. So oftentimes you want to keep this to the bare minimum. You don't want to use too many emojis or, where not needed. But it's a part of communication today is really cultivating these images along with the communications. Now, in today's world, smartphones rule. So most everybody has a smartphone, especially in our current society. And about half the world's population has a smartphone or uses social media. Now, there's a big population out there. And with the social media um, being so prevalent, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, um, LinkedIn, Twitter, which is now X, there's a lot of information flying around that are connected to people's smartphones. So one thing I would like to say about this is, yeah, social media is an important way of communication, and in the workplace, you should separate your social media. So you can have LinkedIn as your official workplace social media platform, but I would suggest if you're operating Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter, to keep your personal accounts private or separate. You know, not link them to your work email, not link them to your maybe your full name, because oftentimes employers, if they're hiring somebody, they may look at your Facebook or look at your Twitter or your Instagram to get a better idea of who you are, and they could use certain things against you. You know, so be very careful in how you build out your presence on social media, because it's quickly becoming a communication tool in business, because businesses do advertise quite a bit on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Now, with smartphones, there's so much these smartphones can do today that businesses are taking advantage of. So with a smartphone, people have this extra connectivity where they can connect through multiple programs, multiple apps, and it's a way of connecting people to the office as well as having your office email on your phone. You could have your office chat platform on your phone. So it's going to increase connectivity and increase. It can sometimes have a detrimental effect on people's health if they are not being able to separate themselves from work and they're constantly checking their connections. They could be overwhelmed. When does work end these days? It's almost 24 hours a day. So there are, you know, some real drawbacks to being so overly connected in this world, especially with all these smartphones that are available. Now, social media, which we were talking about before, when you post on social media, you're conveying your personality. You're conveying what you like, what you don't like. Now, organizations have to be when they would produce their social media, because all organizations have their own Facebook and Twitter, they often hire people to manage their social media, promote their brand, promote their products, promote their company corporate name. So it's been transformational in the last couple of decades, all this social media. And businesses have become more savvy, new positions have been created to cope with it, in marketing, and companies are using it to leverage their strategies and promote themselves. So this in-house social networking applications, as well as outside the house, these there are specific social networking platforms for the enterprise, where they're more internal in the intranet. But the more external sites like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are very important for corporations. And you, as a person who's an extension of the corporation, you need to protect your privacy on your personal social media, having it, you know, blocking it from public view, having a close group of friends and family involved, and not posting anything that could get you in trouble. I worked with a colleague that had a website with explicit pictures of themselves that the company found out about and asked them to take down or remove. So, you know, it could lead to some embarrassing situations if you're not careful. Now, one thing that's in this connected age of smartphones and computers and social media that we have to worry about is cybersecurity. So security is a huge concern to organizations. And I've known people who've been fired for sending themselves emails from work to their private email containing some company documents. That might have just been some company, it could have been a policy guide or just something really not threatening to the company at all, but the work had a zero tolerance. Do not share any of the work information outside the company's email, and sending it to yourself privately, this person was fired. Now, it was a finance company, so you can see how it's a little bit more touchy. But, you know, you're going to be communicating with clients, customers, and employees. So organizations have to worry about a security breach. So security of the electronic information and platforms and phones and computers are very important to protect from being cyber attacked or being ransomed. So oftentimes it's important to keep physical or hard copies or backups that you can't be ransomed if someone hijacks your system and wants you to pay to get access back to it. In fact, in Suffolk County, this happened recently where the Suffolk County offices were hacked and a lot of the social services and offices were down for a long time as they try to recover from being hacked. So in general, this happens quite often to companies, and they need to take steps in protecting their cybersecurity. Because oftentimes employees are the ones letting hackers into and accepting emails, clicking on links, opening attachments. So employees are the weakest link oftentimes with opening the company up to cyber attacks. So, this is something that companies constantly have to work on and involve and educate, because this threat is constantly evolving. And companies have lost billions of dollars having to pay the ransom to get their data back. Now, when we talk about different cultures as far as high versus low context cultures. So effective communication is difficult under a lot of circumstances. And cross-cultural communication is even more difficult. So there's unique challenges that comes from different cultures having different values, traditions, beliefs. So cultures are going to be different in the degree which context influences the meanings that individuals are going to take away from communication. So high context cultures, people rely heavily on nonverbal, subtle cues in communicating with others. And a person's official status, place in society, reputation, is going to carry considerable weight. So what is not said is maybe more significant than what is said. In context, low context cultures rely essentially on spoken written words to convey meanings, body language, and informal titles and secondary to the message. So in the US, we're on the extreme end of the low context. We're pretty much send me the facts, face value of what you say, and we oftentimes will overlook or ignore some of the contextual information that comes with the message. We're more concerned with the message. Where Japan is on the other side of the spectrum, where they have a high context culture where they're going to be really looking at body language, how you interact, how the message is sent and delivered. So there's a lot is read into how something is done. So where in you say Denmark, Germany, Australia, USA, they're not going to read too much. Oh, the letter was sent, a physical letter was sent instead of an email, or a director came to greet me rather than a vice president. Some of these things won't be as meaningful as other cultures. So for example, if the president of the United States goes and visits one of these high context countries, like Japan, Kenya, or Saudi Arabia, and the leading person of their equal status, say the king or their prime minister or their president, doesn't come out to greet them, then that's an insult. So if instead of sending a deputy director to meet with the president of the United States, if they send that instead of the actual president of the country, that would be seen as a contextual slap in the face. So cross-cultural interaction. So here is Exhibit 11.6. So there is complex dynamics surrounding cross-cultural interactions that we talked about, and it's going to involve not only the context but the situation. So understanding one's cultural approach and understanding of the interaction or what's expected in the culture is important. So there's a trade-off between these 5 approaches that are all very in function of one's own or others' cultural approaches. So try not to think of interaction in terms of how both, or try not to think of it like this, how both interaction partners can come to an agreement on the cultural approach to given situations. So let's talk about all 5 of these. Avoiding. So this is low own, low other. So putting aside cultural preferences, values, practices, or customs, often for tactical or strategic reasons. So this is really saying, let's focus on the message, not on the context, not on the culture. Now, imposing is high own, low other. So inserting one's own cultural preferences, values, practices, and customs without acknowledging the other's cultural approaches. So you can see how that would not be a great thing, and may only be used when one person is trying to assert a dominance or power over the other person by saying that, it's our culture means everything and your culture is just going to be ignored at this point. And this could happen when you visit another person's country where they're not going to really care much about your culture. It's all going to be about their culture. So embracing, low own, high other. So putting aside others' cultural preferences, values, and practices and customs in order to acknowledge and embrace others' cultural approaches. So this could be if somebody's important is visiting your company from another culture, you're going to be more tolerant of the fact that they're not familiar with your culture, and you may even brush up on their culture and try to welcome them with some cultural norms of how you say hi or goodbye. For example, if you were if you were having visitors come from an Asian country where bowing is part of their custom, and they're coming to you in the United States, you may instruct your leadership to bow to them as a sign of cultural respect and embracing their culture. Synergizing, high own, high other. So celebrating both partners' cultural preferences, values, and practices and customs in improvisational or flexible way. So again, just high respect on both ends. And then there's the more common compromising, treating other cultural interactions, the give and take, recognizing the cultural differences and practices and customs, and embracing some and putting others aside to help reduce conflict and improve negotiations. So this is typically what I see is compromising on most ends, where you can't really be in an extreme on the low or the high. Now, cross-cultural communications, there are several aspects of this other cultures that can lead to differences in perspectives, perceptions, attitudes, attributions. So words can mean different things to different people, particularly from different cultures. So in our culture, certain words can be bad curse words. In other cultures, they could be friendly phrases. So the connotations matter in this cross-cultural communications, because the same words can imply different things in different languages, and you must be careful. Tone differences or tonal differences can lead to emotional misconceptions during cross-cultural interactions as well. For example, Americans tend to be very loud talkers. So in some cultures, they might see you as being aggressive or combative because your volume is so high. And that's where, these cultural differences can, affect conflict and or help resolve conflicts. Now, cultures may differ in the way that the methods are used to, view conflict, how they're going to resolve conflict, or what is confrontational, how information is communicated. Sometimes it may rely on a lot of verbal cues, it may rely on a lot of nonverbal cues. So, some cultures like to communicate more with metaphor or anthologies. Some, storytelling. Some cultures are more straight up, direct. So they're just, different standards for how people are communicate from different cultures. Some cultures, people are very direct, upfront, and they say what they mean and they do what they say. Some cultures are a little bit more passive aggressive. Some cultures are a little bit, say one thing, do the other. It can be very confusing if you don't know the cultural norms of how people communicate with each other. I know it can be, it takes a lot of experience living in different cultures to really understand or pick up how people communicate. For example, in the United States, people often will say, "How you doing?" or "What's going on?" or "What's new?" We're not really asked. There's more of a greeting and really asking for you to elaborate on details of your life. But if you go to Europe and you ask people, you say people, "How you're doing?" or "How's it going?" they're almost offended. Like, "Do I know you? Should you be asking me this question?" So this is why subtle things like that can mean big differences between different cultures. Now, let's move on to, okay. So a guide for cross-cultural communication. We often do not communicate with people outside our culture because we tend to generalize only from their cultural origins. So, meaning that there could be some cultural confusion because there are far too many cultures for anyone to really understand completely and interpret all these cultural differences. So intercultural communication should be based on a understanding or pursuit of common goals. So there is this thing called a third culture that a group can form when its members seek to incorporate aspects of each member's culture, or so that they sort of their culture rubs off at each other, and they create this sort of new culture or subculture that exists where this group of people of different cultures come together and start gelling together as a group. There's also a business professional culture that is almost a standard, non-threatening cultural commonality of when you're dealing with different cultures, that you're on your best behavior, you're careful what you're saying, you try to limit your cultural norms and try to be communicate in a more general, almost passive way, being careful not to offend anybody. So that's sort of when you're dealing with cultures or cultures are coming together from different aspects, you oftentimes want to steer away from the extremes of your culture when communicating. Now, when communicating with people from a different culture, these are things that you can do to sort of help get this this international business culture aspect that will lower conflict. So prior to the interaction, you want to think about how you're going to maintain your identity with the aspect of trying to create a mutual respect, fairness in the conversation. That you're going to keep that in mind at all times. And during the conversation, you want to consider the other person's viewpoint, and you want to learn from any past misunderstandings, or you want to wait and see if there's a misunderstanding, or ask them to clarify, or ask them how they feel about this. So after the interaction, you want to, think about the culture of your group and learn from these intercultural interactions and use that to build upon your next meeting. So oftentimes, it's experience that makes the better communicator. Now, as far as a manager, if you're a manager for your company, you have to think, you have to be the leader and set the tone for how messages are going to be communicated. So you're going to have to lead with examples. So you want to make sure that you're a good active listener and that you're a reflective listener who communicates and tries to build strong trust in relationships with your colleagues and your subordinates. You want to be aware of how your message is going to come across, how you communicate when your nonverbal communications when you're communicating with your employees. You want to study and think about the best practices with communication to help reduce stress and reduce information overload to your coworkers. You want to have control over your nonverbal communications. Be aware of how you're standing, what your face is looking like, how your message is coming across. And you want to try to reduce the information overload. Don't, you know, not everybody has to be included in the message. Not all technologies have to be used. You want to make sure that you are communicating effectively in a brief way in many cases. And for knowing that people may have more of an apprehension to talk to you as the boss or as the manager, you have to understand that not everybody is going to be as relaxed or easy going during the conversation. Most people may be anxious or have anxiety while talking with you. If there's a crisis at work, remember that technology and communication could be the key to solving this crisis quickly. So understanding that damage can happen very quickly because of smartphones and social media. News or events or information is going to leak out quickly. So you want to just assume that you're not going to be able to contain some crises. You often should acknowledge it and try to work to a solution and never try to cover it up or brush it under the rug, because in today's world, nothing stays a secret any longer. And finally, if you're dealing with cross-cultural communications, you want to be respectful of other people's culture. And you want to do some learning and understand the cross-cultural communication tactics, collaboration, reconciliation that can be used to enhance the outcomes of these meetings, these communications, to understand, come together in a mutual understanding or learning environment where the communication is going to be most effective. Okay, so that is chapter 10. That's chapter 11, communication, and I look forward to talking with you with chapter 12 next. Thank you and take care.